For over 60 years, there was this one treaty that stood out as a shining example of how two rival nations could peacefully share something absolutely essential: water. But what happens when that long-standing promise suddenly snaps? This is the story of the Indus Water Treaty, and it's a story about why its collapse could reshape an entire continent. So let's get right to it. The bombshell drops in 2025. India unilaterally suspends its participation in the treaty. Now, this wasn't just some minor squabble. This was a move that sent absolute shockwaves across the region and, frankly, the whole world of international diplomacy. And that brings us to the big question, right? How did we even get here? How does an agreement that survived actual wars and decades of hostility suddenly find itself on the verge of totally falling apart? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back to the very beginning. All right, first, let's just take a moment to understand why this treaty is on the brink and why that matters so much. To really get the gravity of the situation, you have to appreciate just how important this agreement has been. It's way more than just a piece of paper. It's been a bedrock of stability for the region. Think about it. India and Pakistan have fought several wars since 1960, yet through all of that tension, all of that conflict, the water kept flowing, just as agreed. The Indus Water Treaty was held up globally as the model, as proof that even the bitterest of adversaries could find a way to cooperate on shared resources. That's why its suspension is such an unprecedented, massive deal. So, to understand the treaty's incredible resilience and why its failure is so scary, we have to look at the conflict it was literally born from. It all starts back in 1947 with the partition. The new border that was drawn went right through the Indus River system, and just like that, Pakistan, the downstream country, became totally dependent on India, the upstream country, for its water. Tensions boiled over almost immediately in 1948 when India briefly cut off the water supply. The World Bank saw this and realized it could spiral into a full-blown war, so they stepped in. Their idea? A technical solution, not a political one. And after almost a decade of tough negotiations, the treaty was finally signed in 1960. So, what was the secret sauce? What made this treaty so successful for so long? The answer, it turns out, is in its elegant and incredibly simple core principle. See, instead of getting bogged down in complicated sharing formulas that could be argued over forever, the treaty did something kind of radical. It just divided the rivers. It said, okay, India, you get unrestricted control over the three eastern rivers, the Ravi, the Bias, and the Sutlej. And in exchange, Pakistan gets exclusive rights to the three western rivers, the Indus, the Jhelum, and the Chenab. Simple as that. And you really can't overstate how high the stakes are for Pakistan here. Because of that division, they were given rights to a staggering 80% of all the water in the entire Indus system. It is not an exaggeration to say that the country's whole agricultural economy, the very livelihood of millions of people, depends entirely on that water. Which brings us right back to 2025, and India's decision to just suspend its participation. As you can probably guess, this immediately raised some very serious legal questions. And the whole legal argument really hinges on this, right here, in Article 12 of the treaty itself. The language couldn't be clearer. It says the treaty stays in force unless both parties mutually agree to end it. One side can't just walk away. This clause is the entire foundation of Pakistan's legal challenge. So, based on that article, Pakistan is arguing that India's move is a flat-out illegal breach. They're also saying it violates broader international laws, and that it basically amounts to the weaponization of water. Now, India has talked about changed circumstances as their reason, but Pakistan's argument is that, legally speaking, that claim just doesn't hold water. These tensions didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They've been simmering for years over infrastructure projects. While the treaty does allow India some limited use of the western rivers for things like hydropower, big projects like the Kishanganga and Rathul dams have become major sore spots. Pakistan claims their designs go beyond the treaty's strict limits, giving India the power to control and maybe even restrict the water that flows downstream. And these disputes, they aren't just technical or legal. They have very real-world consequences. So what would actually happen if the water flow is disrupted? Well, the numbers, they paint a pretty stark picture. First thing you have to understand is this. Pakistan is an agrarian economy. A massive 90% of all its freshwater is used for agriculture. The entire food supply chain, the whole economy, is built on the waters of the Indus system. So you take that extreme dependency on water, And then you hear that some reports suggest these actions could lead to a 13% reduction in water flow to Pakistan. In a system that's already stressed for water, that is a huge and frankly dangerous drop. And here's the final impact. That drop in water could translate to an estimated 30% drop in the production of staple crops like wheat, rice, and cotton. We're not just talking about an economic problem anymore. This is a potential food security crisis, a potential humanitarian crisis. So, faced with that terrifying reality, what happens next? Where do we go from here? Well, Pakistan is expected to follow a very clear, multi-pronged strategy. The strategy is basically to fight this on every single front. You start with diplomacy, of course, but you quickly move to legal action through international arbitration courts. A really key step is to petition the World Bank, remember they brokered the deal in the first place, and ask them to step in. And you combine all of that with a wider campaign to rally international support by going to the UN and making sure the world understands the grave humanitarian risks involved. And that brings us to the bigger call to action here. This isn't just a bilateral issue between two countries anymore. The international community is being urged to step up, to enforce treaty compliance, and to help de-escalate the situation. Because many see this as a critical test for how we're going to govern shared water all over the world. And so the collapse of this historic treaty leaves us with a really, really troubling question. In a world that's getting more and more stressed for water, is that shared water a resource for cooperation or a weapon for conflict? The line between those two things is getting dangerously thin. And who gets to draw it? Well, that's a question the entire world may have to answer very, very soon.